Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, June 23rd of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And we have a special guest today. More on that in a moment. This Sunday is June 28th. Each Tuesday, we simply call in from wherever we may be, our homes, our travels, our hotels at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're focusing on the Gospel Lectionary this week or preparing for a virtual discussion group during the pandemic, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information or questions on what the leadoff person on the call would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. Our colleague, Charles Willard, is traveling today, and we know he will be listening and watching the recording once he arrives, and we say hello and let you know that we look forward to having you back with us very soon. So, to complete our foursome this week, we're very excited to have the senior pastor at Palmacia Presbyterian Church in Tampa, Florida, our dear friend and supporter, John Debevoise. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Aaron Mickelson.
John Debevoise.
And I'm Don Upton. And I'll kick things off today by reading the short but deep scripture from Matthew 10, 40 through 42, and I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. And that's the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God.
Well, I'll get things started by just laying out some of the key questions I thought would help us with our conversation today. And there are three questions, and we'll kick off with the first one in a minute. We've been living in Matthew 10 for a few weeks. I think at times struggling with Matthew 10. And my question is, what aspects of the full chapter are especially important or need carry through as we look at these final few verses? One of the ways I raised it with the team was maybe it's a question of if verses 1 through 39, then verses 39 through 42. Or another way to put it is, before you tackle 39 through 42, maybe we need to keep the following aspects of chapter 10 in mind. The second question, with the first question in mind, is how do you explain the gospel role of the first century messenger or envoy to the 21st century audience? And finally, the cup of water is pulled out of the scripture and chapter 10 on a routine basis. At least in my experience, it's quoted all the time to communicate simple acts of compassion and service. But is it actually what Jesus had in mind? So let's get back to the first, which is, and we can keep this as brief as you folks like, what do we need to carry through the early parts of the chapter in order to get into these final verses? Bill Hull, could I start with you, please, sir?
Yes, sir. Good morning, those listening and watching later. Good to have you as a part of our conversation. I'm going to repeat briefly something I think I mentioned last week or recently about this. I understand your question about looking at today's final passage in the light of the whole of chapter 10, but I also think we need to look at this in the light of all of Matthew. And I made this point before as I've read through Matthew in various translations. It strikes me that chapter 10, I don't know if this is the best imagery, is an important pivotal point. Up to this time, it's been focused on Jesus. Now in chapter 10, he calls and identifies by name the 12 who will be participating with him and sends them forth with the instructions that we've been looking at. And then, in a sense, Jesus, at least in Matthew, begins to spend less of his time in Galilee and moving toward Jerusalem, where things come to the conclusion that we're familiar with. So chapter 10 is, as I say, a kind of change of direction or a difference in focus or strategy, whatever image we may want to use. Then within chapter 10, as I've read it various times this week, and this is just my quick little outline, it begins with who. Who is going to assist Jesus, and they are named. And then what are they to do and how are they to do it? They're being sent out to heal. And in my mind, in one sense, the travel instructions are travel light. Don't take a lot with you. Don't rely primarily on your own resources. Trust God and others that you will be equipped as you move along. And then there's an emphasis on be discerning and prepared for conflict, even within your own family. And then this is my way of quickly summarizing the section we're looking at today. You're going out on my behalf, and by the way, don't buy into some grandiose vision of your mission. Focus on seemingly small, insignificant acts of kindness. Even a small glass of water speaks of God's love and presence. So for me, the importance of this chapter is summarized by a professor at Columbia Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, Stanley Saunders, who talks about how Jesus is democratizing the power of ministry and the responsibilities that come with it. In effect, Jesus is putting himself and the disciples somewhat on equal footing. And again, to quote Stanley Saunders, quote, "This discourse as a whole makes clear that God's power is now at work not only in Jesus, but in and through his disciples," end quote. So for me, Don, that's the important thing, is to understand and embrace that we today, and I know the next one of the other questions gets into current more than this, but it's a reminder that we are to go in the name of Jesus and in some ways represent Jesus, and that's quite a responsibility. As we seem to be reminded rather frequently nowadays, there are all kinds of images of what Jesus stands for that get represented, some of which I can and some of which I do not embrace. Thank you.
Thank you. How about you, Sarah Mickelson?
Well, I'm going to quote a modern prophet that I think a lot of people will recognize. Her name is Dory, and she says, "Just keep swimming." I think that the idea of persisting and the idea of moving forward with the confidence that the encounter you might have will be a visit from someone in need, and what they need is what you have to offer, and they don't know it and you don't know it, but you're equipped. So I think about the if-then statement that you posed. I think the important words for me were, don't be afraid. I kind of like the idea of spreading kindness like confetti. And I think that this engages us in that particular work that says any act of kindness, no matter how small, is the best next right step. And I think that that's kind of what I like to think of this whole chapter as about, is moving forward, like you said, democratizing the gospel, which I think is a lovely idea, a lovely notion to think about.
Thanks, Sarah. And John Debevoise, thanks again for joining us today. And I also want to say thank you and the whole family of Palm Lucia Presbyterian Church for making it possible for the four of us to gather every Tuesday morning. What are your thoughts?
Well, Palmacia Presbyterian Church only has gratitude to the four of you for doing this and doing it so faithfully. What a wonderful gift to the larger church. And we're proud that you do this out of the platform of PCPC. And I am personally very grateful for that and find it a great benefit in my devotional life as well as the ministry of preaching. So thank you. With respect to this text today, I first of all note in the context of the whole of chapter 10, what a small portion of it is. It's just 2 verses. And, you know, I was drawn, as others have been, into how the lectionary scholars come to that conclusion as they're preparing the lectionary. You know, there's 42 verses in the whole, and let's just take one whole Sunday and devote it to these 2 at the end. That doesn't happen very often in the lectionary. You don't get a 2-verse slice of the lectionary very often. So that's part of, in the context of chapter 10, what I find engaging about this text is why does the church before us, in a fairly old pattern, say these 2 verses are worthy out of all of the 42 verses in the chapter of standing on their own? That's one part of the context. On the other part of the context, and Bill, like you, I've been very helped by Professor Saunders at Columbia in terms of his expositions of these texts recently, these texts from the 10th chapter of Matthew as he shared them on Working Preacher. That's been good stuff, and it has seemed very pertinent to current events. It's like reading the newspaper with him as you're reading what he's doing in terms of interpreting the text. But I've been helped profoundly by a scholar named Professor Dale Bruner, who taught at Whitworth College for many years. He's now retired. I think he teaches a Sunday school class still. But he wrote a very large commentary in 2 volumes on Matthew, and he calls the first portion of it, which includes this chapter, the Christ book. And it's out of his thesis, based on further broader scholarship, that Matthew's writing to the church and that his gospel is a guide to the church on how to be Christian. You know, that this gospel is not just the life of Jesus, but the guide for the Christian community at that time and today. How do we do this? And his thesis is that this 10th chapter, and he actually takes it all the way back to the 35th verse of chapter 9. He starts it there, of course, noting that the chapters and verses of the Bible are added much later than the composition of the Gospels, and so you can't get necessarily the outline of the Gospel from the chapters and verses that are laid onto it. He says this material begins in the 35th verse and runs to the end of this chapter. He says the chapter and the verse dividers got it right, ending it at verse 42, but they should have started it at verse 35 of 9, and it's all about evangelism. In the primer of how to be Christian in Matthew, this has been a whole section on how do we do evangelism. And, you know, and then it moves as he looks at it for the prayer of the disciples for evangelistic workers, the gifts that you need for the ministry of healing, where to go in mission, what to do in mission, how to do mission. He moves it right along. He thinks it's very much an instructional manual for how we do evangelism, and that it ends here in these last 2 verses. And he actually says this passage, this pericope, really should have been stretched on to the first verse of chapter 11. But that's really a part. 40 and 41 and 42, they should have included the first verse of 11 as a unit in and of itself. And that's the final word about how to do evangelism, and it has to do with hospitality. And I buy that. I think he got that right. And so I read it in the context of the primer on how to do evangelism.
Thank you, John. And I just add one word to it to bring in the whole chapter is time. That we're not talking just about today and what's happened in the past, but there is kind of a wondrous, mysterious component about time and the small things that you may do that may be inexplicable, but you do them because there are children involved, there are the immature, there's the future. So I would say time is something it carries through to these final passages. Well, Sarah, I'm going to go back to you with this next question. And the reason I brought it up, it's about messengers, envoys, because I have a footnote at the bottom of my Bible that I think was written 15 years ago. There was a gentleman named Bill Wallace who led the lectionary classes at PCPC for years. And at the bottom, in bold letters, it says, must always consider the messenger of the envoy and the rules of the time. So I'm curious, and the question for the three of you is, how do we explain the messenger to the 21st century mind? Because it does matter, and there were rules and disciplines and strengths in following those. So Sarah, let me start with you first, please.
Okay. So when you send somebody, or when you are sent by somebody, you represent them. Interestingly enough, I remember an experience I had, and I think I've shared this before. My mom played bridge quite a bit, and she had a friend she played bridge with. That person was on vacation in the Bahamas or Barbados or Bermuda, I think Bermuda, and met a family from Scotland. Well, as it turned out, I took a summer internship with a theater company out of Dallas, Fort Worth, and they had been invited to the International Theater Festival in Edinburgh. And my mother's friend was very excited to give me the name of the Scottish family she met. And they lived not far outside of Edinburgh and really encouraged me to pick up the phone and ring them up and reach out. And I was a little intimidated to do that, so I neglected to do that. And I thought, they won't know me from Adam's Tomcat, to quote my mother. And so I chose not to reach out, and lo and behold, the phone in the venue where I was working in the theater rang, and it was for me. It was like a payphone that rang, and they said, oh, it's for Sarah. So I go to the phone knowing I have no idea who's calling or why, and it was the family. They were looking for me, and they wanted to invite me to come to lunch on a time and place and date where I could break away from the work, and I was kind of embarrassed that I hadn't reached out. And then when they gave me instructions what train to take, what road to walk up, and they met me at the train station, and they picked me up, and they drove me to their flat, and they provided such what I call an extravagant meal. It was Yorkshire pudding and roast beef and all the things that they thought I would find interesting to eat, and they invited everybody home in the middle of the day to have lunch with this American. And so I was even more embarrassed because they were so generous and so kind and so deliberate with their affection. And I asked them, I said, why? Why are you being so nice? Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know who I am, and you've never met my mom, you never met my father, you don't know anything about me. And they said, well, anyone who's a friend of this woman that played bridge with my mother, her name was Pat Bernstein, they say, anybody that was friends with Pat Bernstein must be somebody special. So I tell this story because they were so persistent in their kindness that they made the effort to find me when I did not want to be found. They made such a deliberate effort to include me in their kindness and their family. They sent me home from Scotland. I probably shouldn't say this because U.S. Customs will come and find me, but they sent me home from Scotland with white heather. They had gone to the Highlands in the weeks before meeting me, and they picked white heather because their oldest daughter was getting married, and it's tradition in Scotland to include white heather in your wedding bouquet. They had picked me some for me to bring back, which I did put in my wedding bouquet many years later, but it was such a sweetness that I forgot how valuable it is to have someone speak on your behalf and make a way for you well in advance of you just by simply being kind. So that's my story about messengers and Envoy. I think we represent the foundation, and everything that we spring forth from comes from that foundation and speaks about who our master is.
Thanks, John. I was prompted by our old friend Bill Wolof on this one, so I have no doubt you probably discussed this with him as well. Your thoughts on messengers and envoys?
When you first asked the question, Don, I thought you put it in the context a bit of its intersection with us today. Would you say the question again?
Yes, that there were rules and protocols in the first century that were understood about the role, but you leap forward to the 21st century. How do we explain that today? Because things have changed.
Well, I think Sarah's spot on, and the text has engaged me in the same way, and I'll talk about by that I mean in her narrative about the personal experience of what hospitality looks like in our lives. I think the text engages that way, and so that the conduits of the message, the bearers of the message of the evangel. If this is the doctrine out of Matthew's gospel on how to do evangelism, this emphasis on the evangelists, those who bear it, that it's a personal narrative, that it involves their hospitality to one another, and that is colored by the kind of beautiful narrative that Sarah is telling, and that every student of the Bible on reflection can probably get to in their own journey. Some experience, very much as Sarah gave it, a little serendipitous perhaps, of where they received hospitality in a personal way, that in reflection became more and more meaningful over time. And that's the dominant way I think in which the text has engaged with me. And I think about particularly my in-laws, because the form of their hospitality was different than some of what I knew in my own home, and had sort of the obligatory sense in it that if you came into their home, you were expected, and they would be hurt, and as they expressed through their countenance, if you did not sit and drink a cup of coffee and eat some portion of whatever they ritualistically offered you, whether it was grapefruit. Bill knew my in-law, so he knows what I'm talking about. But they were hurt. If you came in and said, "I was just dropping this off and I'm going to run," that was an offense. You had unintentionally offended them. You had to sit and drink coffee, and you had to eat something that they brought you to eat. So that the nuances of the narrative of hospitality and how we communicate that, I think, are in this text. And touch evangelism. Evangelism is always personal. It's always one person to another person in the intimacy of things like cutting heather and bringing it to you, so that you take a bit of Scotland with you. It's a very personal narrative that way. What I think is, in terms of envoys, is expansive for me in the text this week is what Bruner points out, and that is that he says there's in the language here, there's a movement being made with respect to not just receiving one another personally, but receiving the apostolic witness. That's what this talk about the apostles is. It goes through this hierarchy of reception. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet welcomes a prophet. And finally, the name of a righteous person is welcomed, and even a cup of cold water from a little one welcomes a hierarchy. What he's doing, what the gospel writer is doing, Bruder believes, is showing that there's a chain from the apostles. And in fact, the chain is beyond the apostles, And he says this phrase, the one who sent me, is a particular kind of name. He likens it to Matthew's use of the word of God as Father. It's another name like Father that Matthew uses, the one who sent me. So that would you share in the kind of personal greeting of the envoy, of the evangelist? You are greeting the evangel itself. It's like the priest handling the sacrament. You're receiving the body of Christ, the evangel, and that welcome, the heather and the coffee, they are not just personal niceties of evangelism, they are the sacramental tools by which we receive the good news of the evangel in our intimate person, and we're bearing it from the apostles. It's, it's their gift, their message that we're holding within us, amongst us, and that we're then passing and sharing on through this vehicle of hospitality, through this coffee and heather and a cup of cool water even. I find that powerful stuff. I mean, that you take your shoes off when you walk to the door of your Scottish ancestors or the Darrenfall's front step, because it's holy ground you're entering in. And he says he also says, and he's persuaded me obviously on this, that this is, if it's unconscious, that's one thing, but he says it can be conscious, and the consciousness, which he thinks is good, but we should be aware of it, that comes particularly when he uses the language in the name of. In the name of, when you receive someone in the name of, then you are aware of, the sacredness of the evangel, the apostolic witness that you are receiving at that point. Boy, and all of a sudden, you realize why they said these two verses can carry their own freight. Let's let them stand alone this Sunday. This is substantive stuff here in these two verses.
Well, Bill Hold, one of the reasons I brought up the tradition of messengers, the rules of envoys, is I always try to think about if someone's facilitating a class on lectionary or having some kind of discussion group, what questions would you ask? And what I was thinking about is that you would what happens when you don't follow the rules? What happens if you pull out the messenger or the envoy? If you have a kingdom speaking to a kingdom, or a queen speaking to a king, or a village speaking to a village. And when I went down and removed that role, things fell apart, but it sounded like gospel language. The example I would have is, well, if you don't have the system of envoys, you break the pathway of communications. Any action, any messenger, any opportunity for understanding in those days was destroyed. I mean, imagine if we lost our messenger systems today. There's no way to find understanding without that. I was also thinking about the special purpose of an envoy. An envoy is recognized as a role, as an extension of whoever they're representing. What if that were severed? And I think that's something to do with what the disciples are called to do. What does it do with the sender? The sender is isolated. The kingdom is isolated. What role do we have with the kingdom of God? There's isolation. And the one who's receiving is isolated. It's an end of understanding. In a way, it freezes time. If the envoy, the messenger, goes away, time is frozen. You no longer can work on facts. You have to work on assumptions. You have to use your imagination instead of the facts. It creates reliance on third parties, people who don't know, people who don't have the facts, because you have an envoy that you can depend on to link you to the kingdom you're trying to speak to. It puts weight on imagination instead of on your fellow person, instead of the dependence that you have on somebody you can trust to provide that information. And it seems like it's not just a cut off of the pathway, it's a cut off of human interaction. And I think, and I was looking at the tradition of envoys and messengers, that it actually is viewed as severing or dividing the person that is being represented, as in the person no longer has eyes to see. The king no longer has arms at which to shake your hand. The king no longer has feet on which to travel. The king no longer has a chariot on which to visit you. It all goes away, which for me, it's like if you're running a class today, ask the question, what is it like not to have the messenger or not to have the envoy? And when I went down that list, the language I had about pathways and kingdom put a burden on me, and at the same time, it kind of clarified what Jesus had in mind in terms of the messenger's responsibility. Bill, what about you? What have you been thinking about on this subject?
Thank you. I appreciate that emphasis, Don. And I think what I want to say, try to say briefly, will echo Sarah and John. When I think about this question, I look at the atmosphere today, and I would describe it as supercharged. The media make it possible for people in an instant to assert anything, posturing, playing one-upsmanship, degrading anyone who disagrees with them. And as I've said before, I think this happens across the political and social spectrum. And maybe I'm just being an idealist, but I think what Jesus' instructions then remind us of now is the world needs, and these are my words, quiet, focused, caring, generous, courageous, communal acts of kindness. And we see that today. I'm grateful that some of the news media tell those stories, and you've seen them, that to me meet that standard of acting for the greater good. Now, someone for me who represents this, and you may or may not have heard of, Father Greg Boyle. He's an American Jesuit priest. I got to hear him in person at Eckerd some months ago. He's the founder and director of something called Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. He deals with the gangs there. He deals with the worst of the worst in one sense. And I purposely am drinking from my Father Boyle cup this morning because of a quote that he has on it. And I don't know if you can see this. Probably not. Anyway, it says, sooner or later, we all discover that kindness is the only strength there is. Now, mind you, if you hear him or read him, he has dealt, I forget how many hundreds of funerals he has done for gang members. He has not solved the problem in all the years he's been there. And yet, what does this priest who faces almost daily violence and death, what's his mantra? Kindness is the only strength there is. I think that is so relevant today. Now, one other quick observation. I've read back through Matthew again, and I was struck by something. Now, based on my reading, and I may be wrong, Jesus makes much in his commission of the ministry of healing. But as far as I can tell, now I think the disciples may well have been engaging in healing, and it just doesn't get reported in Matthew. The only reference that I can find to the disciples' healing is in chapter 17, after the transfiguration, when Jesus comes down from the mountain, and he's told the disciples could not heal the man's boy. Now, again, others of you may correct me. And I think, I don't know what Matthew's purpose was, but I didn't count up the number of healing experiences in Matthew. And when we talked about this a week or two ago, I said then, I think some of you agree, I take healing in a very broad way. I think this nation and this world need healing. Physical, yes, but relational, communal, racial healing. So I think of healing in a very broad way. And to me, Matthew says, not that it's just about healing, but healing, being a healing presence is so central. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question I wanted to bounce off of everybody had to do with a cup of water. And because it's quoted so often, it's used in context and out of context, and this whole discussion started with, let's bring chapter 10 into it. I thought, let's talk about a cup of water, and we can look through it through traditional dimensions, or we can look at it through new dimensions. But my question is, do we read it the way Jesus actually intended? And John, I'm going to come to you first. And the reason I wanted to ask this question was I've been on a journey with this, which goes to chapter 10 being about the arc of time. That it's about today. It's about evangelism today, but it's also about evangelism tomorrow. And if I read it correctly, and I'm not sure I do, the little ones, little children, are other followers of the way at different stages in their journey, different stages of maturity. And if I want to use little ones or little children as a metaphor, then I think I'm asked to look at the group in terms of big ones and little ones. And that might be where some distortions have taken place. So I was thinking, well, am I reading this right? So I'll put it on myself. And I was thinking if this is about maturity and little ones and responsibility, sometimes it may get read as a small act by large people for little people. And sometimes I hear that echoing, a small act by large people for little people, that it becomes a message of humility of the large people for the little people. A large person doing a small act for a small person. You large disciple do a small act for the young, the small, the immature. And I'm saying it in this way because I'm trying to make it sound so wrong on purpose. And I'm not trying to say that acts of service, acts of small things, acts of satisfying someone's thirst doesn't matter. I'm just wondering, John, if that's what Jesus means in this particular passage. Because I'm wondering if it's about time, then it really has nothing to do with whether a disciple is humble or has vision or not. But the fact is that they don't. It's about water and it's about little ones. And a little one can be 10 years old, or 25, or 85, or 90 years old, that they're a little one today, and that there's the mystery of the water in the future, and evangelism goes on, and that the water isn't connected with the big ones much in any way other than the obligation to serve those who will be the future. And I'm wondering if the little one may be a big one tomorrow, or in 20 years or 30 years, but that they may have power, intellect, insight, and wisdom that far surpasses those that gave them a cup of water. And I would even say, for me, looking at someone today, any human being, I don't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow. I don't know the power they bring. I don't know what their world of evangelism is. I don't know where they travel. But there's this simple discipline that the cup of water may not be a small thing at all, but it's necessary. And the little ones are more important than the big ones because time changes. People change. They will venture out tomorrow and far surpass in a day what the big one may be. So I was trying to extract the act of humility and the act of smallness for something that reaches over today, 1900 years, where the small ones are actually the topic, not the big ones. So I was challenging myself with that rethinking. But John, what about you? What's been your thoughts on this cup of water, especially in this unusual year, unusual time we're living in?
Well, once again, two verses that I start by thinking, the lectionary scholars have made a mistake giving us a very thin slice of the cheese for this Sunday. They not only are the two verses deeply substantive enough to provide preaching for a year, but even this phrase is likely substantive enough to provide preaching for a month, anyhow. And starting with what you lift up, Don, the little ones, that's the course of considerable question by biblical commentators and scholars over the years, going back even to Jerome. And part of the challenge in it, as I understand it, is that it is literally translated little ones. Will Wellman and I got into a dialogue about this week. He kept saying little ones, meaning the children. And I kept saying, but it doesn't say that. It just says little ones. And he kept saying, yeah, little ones, meaning the children. And we do that, kind of exposition from what we think the phrase means to what it means. But what it's saying is the little ones. And that's part of the challenge in it. Now I don't think it has in English a kind of an Irish lilt to it, doesn't it? Like you're talking about leprechauns or something here. Hi, the little ones, and you brought them a cup of cold water, didn't you? And wasn't that a good thing? But there's mystery, or at least substance in the phrase that ought to be meditated on and unpacked. The cup of cold water, if Charles was here out of his time spent in the Middle East and biblical studies, I think in terms of the importance of the context, he would remind us that first century Israel in many ways was, in many places of it at least, a desert. Water is a precious commodity. We tend today, because especially in America, and even Western Europe, I mean, we go get water from multiple spigots in our homes and open it up and just get water and take it for granted, unless we pay $1 for a plastic bottle of it, which we are happy to do. In third world countries, the precious commodity of water doesn't just run out of their homes and spigots, and that's not true in Mombocroshu, Haiti, and it isn't true in Popola, Uganda. We have to dig wells, a number of which communities we've been a part of have helped to finance, just so that people can get water. So the preciousness of water and the gift that's being offered in a cup of cool water carries more freight than what I think the modern, particularly American Christian, realizes when we first read it. Remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia? Remember how it begins? That they're out and they come up on the shimmering spot in the desert, one man there at a very simple well. It's not an elaborate oasis, but he's there. He's in the middle of the desert. He's assuaging his thirst. And way off in the distance on a camel comes this little figure clothed in black, and he gets closer and closer. It's Omar Sharif, but as he gets, within a relative distance on his camel, he picks up his rifle and shoots him, the guy at the well, across several hundred yards, shoots him and kills him because he's drinking from his well. He has no idea who he is. But, the attack, the invasion of somebody on your well was an offense that, constituted capital punishment, that you shot him on sight when you did it. So there's power in water, and we live today in a world where millions of people do not have clean drinking water. So let us not go too glibly over the water itself, and that it's cool water. Cool water is even a step above, drinking water. That is cool at that. So I think it has immediate application with respect to the scarcity of certain resources for the modern world, Christians and non-Christians alike, and very practically what we might do to help ensure clean drinking water for people around us. But little ones looks to me like it's been, by many biblical commentators, expanded to mean Christians who have less maturity than other Christians. And I am meaning they're less experienced or newer in terms of their introduction to the faith. And so, and I think clearly there's grounds for that. I mean, I do believe that that's a historic part of what the interpretation has been, and I think that's a validation that there is substance in that there's some way in which it's being used to indicate more experienced Christians greeting and hospitality and sharing the evangel, the good news, with those who are newer into the gospel. It's like sharing the preciousness of a cup of water, which gives life itself to them. However, I go much slower in this modern age, meaning in the contemporary age of my own life and the moment that I live in. I find myself going much slower, simply wanting to roll over a little one and say, it means adults who don't know as much. What is an adult thing to do? Say, oh, yeah, this is about adults, right? Even though it says little ones, oh, yeah, it's about, fiddlesticks. It's about children. And we just can't stomach the idea that we wouldn't be at the center of the gospel, as adults. No. What if we just live with the possibility that he's saying you have to welcome children with the evangel? You have to welcome the children, and so they cry, and you have to figure out how you teach them, and you have to figure out how you do faith formation with them, and woe to you, because if you refuse them, you're refusing, back through the hierarchy, Jesus himself and God, the one who sent Jesus. When you don't welcome a child who comes stumbling up to the door of the church, you are refusing God. I think that's right. I mean, I think that's what the text is saying, and we creatively deny it as a way of avoiding the implications of it. I think it's immediately relevant. To say nothing about what that means in a county where 2,000 children in the last year, in 2019, had to be separated from their parents because of neglect or abuse by the law. I mean, we live in a world where in the last 2 months, I can think of 3 children in my own county who were murdered by their family members. And so a text that calls for welcoming them is a powerfully relevant text indeed for Christians today.
How about you, Bill Hull?
Thank you. I think that personally it's intentional that this comes where it does. And by the way, John, thank you for that insight about the chapter break. I'd had some discomfort reading it, so you helped me understand that it really, I agree with, what was his name, Dale Bruner, in how this fits together as a unit. And again, I alluded to this in my response to the first question. Jesus ends on a note of, I think, challenging today's world tremendously. It's not about grandiosity. It's not about posturing. It's something as simple as a cup of cold water. And by the way, Mark Davis notes for us in this verse that the verb to give water and the noun for cup come from the same root word. Water and cup are associated etymologically in Greek. And then Mark Davis goes on to say, cup of cold water is a proverbial expression for a minor service, and he calls it practical loving kindness is the result and test of discipleship. Reminding us, Matthew 25, when you do it or do not do it to the least of these, you're doing it or not doing it to me, reinforcing what you said, John. Now, I've mentioned this story before. In 1988, I took a month-long tour of China. Before we ever left the U.S., and once we got there, we were daily reminded, don't you dare drink water out of the tap. Don't even wash your hands with it or brush your teeth. And so in every hotel room, there were these huge thermoses of boiling hot water. You had to be careful not to scald yourself. And when it finally cooled down a little, the boiling had taken any pleasant taste out of it. In the restaurant, you could only drink from bottled drinks or bottled water. They were considered to be safe. Now, time after time, we would go to visit a church during the work week, and with only a few exceptions, there would be at least several people from the church at the outer edge of the property near a sidewalk, literally holding trays of cold, safe water. And if people walked by, they would offer it to them. Now, even though China had opened some, they were not allowed to provide any kind of overt witness. And they told us these stories that people would occasionally take the water and say, why are you doing this? And their response was, to use some American colloquialism, my boss told me to do it. Who's your boss? And it opened the door for some witnessing on their part. And these were people, taking time off, or they were whatever. They were there. I saw it over and over again, literally giving cups of cold water. And to me, it was an example that in the face of the destructive power of empire, Christ was represented by quiet persons reaching out and offering water in the name of the water of life, Jesus Christ. And I heard some stories of people at work who would be questioned by a fellow worker, why are you not engaging in the typical ways to try to get around doing what we're supposed to do? You're doing the job you're supposed to do. And it would, again, offer them an opportunity to talk about their boss. Who was it that was the guide in their life? And Again, I think echoing what I said earlier, I think what the world needs now, to use that song, is love, sweet love, kindness. It is so tempting to get drawn into the anger of this age. And an important witness for us is literally and figuratively to offer cups of cold water, especially to those considered to be the least.
Thanks. Sarah, my friend, you get to wrap up on this topic.
Well, a couple of things crossed my mind when I saw your question, and as I read this passage, I thought of the Samaritan woman in John 4, who Jesus approaches at the well at midday and says, "Please give me something to drink." And I think that's a lovely way of engaging in hospitality, is asking someone to help you when you're vulnerable. I thought of this passage this week as I was prepping for a Sunday school class I covered for Will on Sunday about Ishmael being thrown by a bush without water, and that water was what restored him and brought him back from the edge of death. I think about how hard it is when you're after a hurricane. You can get anything to drink except water, and how difficult it is to not just want cold water. I remember after the first hurricane I experienced with my family, my mother said, "You can have as much Coca-Cola as you want." I said, "I don't want Coke. I want water." So I think there's something essential about the element, that there is a spiritual connotation to it, especially in this particular passage. But I also felt like it's important to acknowledge that the little ones in this particular passage were considered disposable. They were considered chattel that you would barter with, or that you would use to generate wealth or generate an income for a larger group of people. So the children that Jesus is speaking to, he's elevating them. He's bringing them into the family as a center point, not something out on the edges to be disregarded and to get leftovers. He's bringing them in. So he's restoring them to a position of prominence in a world where they've been treated as if they were disposable. So I think there's something to be said for that thinking. And then in our world, and making the leap to this particular century at this particular time, I think this really charges us to reach out to those who are vulnerable and are considered by our standards or in our world to be invisible. And I think that water is so hard to come by if you're homeless on the street, especially during Tampa's summertime. I mean, you can put a cup out when it's going to storm and get water, but for the most part, having a vessel to gather water with is essential. And I can't imagine how difficult that is. Being a spoiled Westerner where I can walk to any tap and draw cold water. Or I can, I gather by the ice machine to equip my glass with something to cool it down. So I think there's this lovely, essential spiritual quality to this particular verse. And I'm with you, John. I think that this is, I would say, heaped with an opportunity to consider and to ruminate and to reflect on what these two passages mean, these two verses, this small slice of cheese, which I think is a lovely idea to think about, and how sustaining that is. So those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you. And John, we're so happy you're here, and you're always welcome. And we have just 3 or 4 minutes left, and I wonder if we could just take advantage of your presence here. If there's any summary you'd like to give, or especially maybe your reflections on your choices to use the lectionary to guide you and your work through the year. Could we turn to you to wrap up on those?
Well, with respect to the last thing you ask, and hold up your finger when I'm 1 minute away, Don, because I'll go on too long. But I am a lectionary preacher, and I have found it to be productive and expansive. It's productive in that it forces me to walk through a whole of gospel and scripture. And when I don't do that, I tend to unavoidably go to passages that I find precious and that narrows them and selects them in a way that may avoid the meaning of the gospel as a whole. So I also find great unity in it with the church around the world. It's not only meaningful to me, but helpful to me that the passage that we're looking at this week is the one that my sister-in-law is preaching from in Orlando, and that I know Emmanuel Mfambi will be hearing in, in Uganda and also in the Catholic Parish Church in Mombikro Haiti. I mean, and there's great unity in that in terms of the church, and that the church pulls off that unity. The wider church, meaning across denominations and traditions, that we pull off that unity in this world, fragmented beyond the point of comprehension, that's a miracle. So I just like being close to the miracle. So how do we do that? How is it that we get that kind of unity, that the church in Taiwan this Sunday is going to, at least about half of them, using the same text we're looking at here? That's just the Holy Spirit. So I do it in part just to walk close to the miracle of the Holy Spirit, with it. And I want to read just the first verse of 11 so people can hear how this might be a better ending to the pericope. Now, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and proclaim his message in their cities. There's the move of location. It ends 10. And anytime, in the gospel, when he stops one place and moves to another, it's, I think, a way of saying, now we're actually moving on to another passage there. So if you're preaching this Sunday or teaching it, I encourage you to put that first verse in. You don't get like a ticket from the lectionary scholars if you do that. Yeah. Finally, on little ones, or acts of service, I think Bruder's right when he says, this is here because in the hierarchy of jobs we have in the Christian life, from the person sweeping the porch to the person climbing up in Billy Graham's pulpit and proclaiming the message that Sunday, everyone is a part of delivering the evangel, receiving it and delivering it. And if what you're doing is passing out the cups of cold water, that is integral to the proclamation of the evangel, as is the person who's in front of the television camera being beamed around the world. I think it's a part of emphasizing the honest role every Christian has in lifting up the evangel before the thirsty world.
Thank you, John. And are you preaching on this coming Sunday?
Nicole, I am in the connection. Nicole is in the sanctuary. Yeah.
That's great. And the reason I ask that, folks that listen in, especially during pandemic, that the information I'm going to give you might be helpful if you're looking to engage on this subject again, hear sermons, other discussions, Sunday school classes. I would commend to you Palmacia.org, PALMACEIA.org. And Palmacia Presbyterian Church is located at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.